I'm Rose Miron. I'm Vice President for Research and Education at the Newberry Library. I am a historian by training. My area of expertise is Indigenous history in the Great Lakes, especially as it relates to public history and public memory. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about the region that we all live in, especially in the era leading up to and through the American Revolution. Before I jump into that, I want to say just a little bit about the Newberry Library. I'm not sure how many of the folks in the room have been there, but if you're interested in this lecture, you'd probably be interested in the Newberry. So I just want to say a few words about that. For anybody who doesn't know, the Newberry is a rare book and manuscript research library. We are free and open to the public, and we have been free and open to the public since 1887. Anybody can access our reading rooms as long as you are over the age of 14, which I think everybody in this room is. And we have a very large collection. These are some of our collection strengths. As you can see, we do have strengths in American Indian and Indigenous studies, as well as Chicago and the Midwest. Almost a third of our users are folks who are doing genealogical research, so that's a very popular thing that people do. And just to give you a sense of the size of the collection, we have about 1.6 million books, 5 million manuscript pages, over 500,000 maps. And if you were to line up all of the shelves that we have books on, it would be more than 27 miles, so more than a marathon of shelving, not books, shelving. So you can imagine how many books we have. Our mission is really about connecting people with that collection. So we want to invite you into the reading room. If you're not interested in coming into the reading room, we want to invite you to engage in the collection in other ways. For some people, that happens through exhibitions. We have one exhibition open right now that is about some of our digitization work, and we have another exhibition opening next month that I think if you're interested in this talk, you will probably be interested in, that is specifically about the Declaration of Independence. So I would encourage you to check that out when it opens next month if you're interested. We also have a wide range of public programs. Many of them, like this one, are live streamed, so you can tune in online, or you can, of course, come down to the library and join us in person. And we also have adult education classes. And again, many of these are available online. Others are only in person. But these are a chance to engage directly with scholars and folks who are studying all kinds of topics and teaching folks about them. So if you're interested, I encourage you to check out our website. Again, anybody is welcome to get a reader's card and access our collections. I'm going to be showing a couple of images of various Newberry collection items tonight. You can go in and you can touch those items yourself if you want. You can go look at them in our reading rooms. So I really encourage you to think about doing that. The other thing I just briefly want to mention before I jump in is that a lot of what I'm going to be talking about tonight is pulled from a project that we launched in fall of 2024 called Indigenous Chicago. This was a collaborative project that we worked on for almost 5 years with Native communities in Chicago, as well as tribal nations who consider Chicago part of their ancestral homelands. So the website is much bigger than what I will have time to talk about today. It includes high school curriculum. It includes 9 new digital maps that think about the Chicago region as Indigenous space. It includes oral histories with community members and a number of other digital resources. So again, if you're at all interested in some of the things I'm talking about tonight, I would highly encourage you to check that out. The URL is indigenous-chicago.org. Okay, so just a little bit of a roadmap for today. I'm going to start by painting a picture of the place that we now know as Chicago and more broadly Northeastern Illinois, kind of leading up to the late 1700s. As we're going to see, there is virtually no European settlement in this region up until the late 1700s. Then I'm going to move into talking about the impact that the American Revolution had on Native people in this region and sort of what was going on during the war. We're going to do kind of a deep dive on one Potawatomi leader named Sugannock and some of the efforts that he did to, he actually sided with the American cause in some ways. So we're going to talk about him and some of his actions. And then I'm going to end by discussing the aftermath of the revolution, but also kind of bring us up to the present and really just explain how many of the tribal nations who were removed ultimately in the 19th century continue to maintain connections to this place. All right, so with that, I'm going to jump in. The first thing I always like to say when I am doing these presentations is that Native people believe that they have been here and across the United States since time immemorial. Time immemorial means a time that is longer than human memory. So it is, since the beginning of time. And so that is how we in Native studies talk about Native people and their presence on the land. Every Native nation has creation stories that include them quite literally emerging from the land. And so that's how we talk about Native people when we think about how long they have been here. Certainly, we have archaeological records that can provide some actual dates for how long Native people have been here, but archaeological records are continuing to be discovered and uncovered, and there's a limited amount of data that we can get from those records. So I always think it's important to think about Native stories and Native creation stories as an important part of the picture that we paint when we think about what it means to be Indigenous and how long Indigenous people have been here. So Native people have been in what is now the Chicago region since time immemorial. How do we know that? As I mentioned, certainly creation stories, as well as archaeological records, but I'm going to walk you through some of the other evidence that we have showing that. And I'm going to walk you through a little bit of the many different nations that have called this land home over time. So Chicago is a fairly complicated place when it comes to thinking about Native nations. There are almost a dozen different Native nations that have called this place home, and they weren't all here at the same time. As we're going to discuss a little bit later in the presentation, the Chicago portage was an extremely advantageous way to connect the Great Lakes to the Mississippi River Basin. And so Native people had been using that portage since time immemorial to travel between these two regions. As a result, we see a lot of different Native nations moving in and out of this region throughout time. So some of the earliest archaeological records that we have of this region usually get classified as the Oneata people. The Oneata people are very likely related to what today are called the Ho-Chunk people. So in the spirit of kind of thinking about Native communities today as being connected to their ancestors since time immemorial, we simply refer to those earliest Native nations here as the Ho-Chunk. As European settlement started and different conflicts were going on between Native nations, Ho-Chunk people moved more north and west, and folks within the Illinois Confederation and the Kickapoo and Mascoutin moved more into this area, along with the Miamia and the Wea. Those are the groups that are here when European settlers first arrive in the 1670s. Again, we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. But those are some of the groups that are here at the earliest point. And then again, as European trading is increasing and as different conflicts are going on across the Great Lakes, those groups move more west and south. And at that point, folks like the Sauk and Meskwaki, as well as the Menominee and Anishinaabe, move into the region. I want to focus especially on the Anishinaabeg, which is this group down at the bottom here. So the Anishinaabeg, you may have also heard this group of people referred to as the Three Fires Confederacy or the Anishinaabe. This is made up of the Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Odawa people. Those three groups are a confederacy, and together they make up the Anishinaabe. So today in our presentation, we're primarily going to talk about the time period when it was primarily Anishinaabe people that were living in what is now northeastern Illinois. You're especially going to hear me talk about Potawatomi and Odawa folks. So I just want you to know that that's who I will primarily be talking about today, but those are certainly not the only people that consider Chicago part of their ancestral homelands. Okay. How else do we know that Native people have been here since time immemorial? When Europeans arrived in this region, this place had a name already. European settlers did not name it. That is because many Native nations already had connections to this place and they already had a name for it. If you have ever been on one of the Chicago architectural boat tours, I guarantee you that you have heard that somebody has told you that Chicago is the name for a stinky onion. This is kind of true, as you can see from the slide here. Many of the indigenous names for Chicago do have something to do with onions or something that smells very strong. But I think the myth there is that there is a single indigenous name for Chicago. That's a myth because there are multiple indigenous nations that lived in this place and traveled through this place prior to European arrival, and they all had slightly different names for this place. Again, if you are interested in this, there's a whole section on the Indigenous Chicago website where you can listen to sound clips of all of these names. But just to give you one example, the Potawatomi name for Chicago is Shagagowinak. So you can sort of hear how that was interpreted by, first French settlers who then, wrote down something resembling Chicago. You'll be able to see it on some of the maps that I'll show in a second. The other big clue, as I kind of alluded to earlier, that tells us that Native people have been here for a very long time is archaeological records, of course. This is a village site map that we created for the Indigenous Chicago project. And these records, this village site map is based off of archaeological records as well as information that early European settlers wrote down as they were encountering Native people. As you can see, there was a lot of Native villages throughout this region. Again, all up and down, the coast, all further inland. And again, you can this is an interactive map on the website, so you can explore that as you would like. The villages in this region, unsurprisingly, were very intertribal. As I mentioned, it was primarily Anishinaabe people that were in this region during the time period that we're mostly going to be talking about today. But a lot of these villages, even if they were led by an Anishinaabe person, there were also Sauk and Meskwaki people living in that village, sometimes Menominee. Just depending on the time period, there were often many different groups of people living within these villages. There were these very complicated kinship networks across the Great Lakes, and those became very important, again, as I'm going to talk about a little bit later. The other thing I just want to note on this map that kind of makes Chicago unique in this kind of pre-contact time period is the fact that Chicago was used as a place for seasonal rounds. So Native people in the Great Lakes participated in a practice called seasonal rounds, in which they moved throughout a larger location based on the season and based on what was available. So many of the archaeological records from this era highlight Indian villages and Indian camps. And one of the things that we learned from talking to contemporary Native people who have, studied these maps and who, of course, know immeasurably more about their history than I do, we learned that these more temporary camps were very likely seasonal camps in which Native people were coming in temporarily and then moving locations. So Chicago has both of these things. It has the more permanent village sites in which people are inhabiting those sites year round, and it has these more seasonal villages. So for Chicago, in the summer, people would often come in to do planting and fishing. In the fall, it was more of a shift to hunting and harvesting. In the winter, especially, folks from what is now Michigan would come down south to hunt small fur-bearing animals. And then certainly in the late winter and early spring, right around the time that we're at right now, there would be maple sugaring going on. What you're seeing in this image here from Seth Eastman is actually a sugar camp. So that was certainly something happening in the region. And then in the spring, people would come in and harvest alliums like the ramps or the small wild onions that the city is ultimately named for. It's also really important to note that Native people, as I have explained, were not static, right? They're moving seasonally, but it's a myth to think that they didn't understand territory or that they didn't have a sense that they owned or held control over large areas of land. And that's, I think, something that becomes really important when we get to the period of making treaties. That said, Chicago did not exist in a vacuum. It was connected across the Great Lakes to all of these different places. So I know that the colors on this are probably a little hard to see with the lighting, but Chicago is essentially connected, as far east as what is now Montreal. You can see that there are routes going up through what is now Detroit and through the eastern Great Lakes. And then also routes that go further west all the way over to the Mississippi. So again, people were traveling through Chicago to get to these many different routes. And it was a place that many people moved through. I'm going to talk just a little bit more about the Chicago Portage since I mentioned it very briefly earlier. And I do think it's a big kind of piece of why Chicago is already a very important place for Native people before the arrival of European settlers. So this map reconstructs what the landscape of Chicago looked like prior to many of the changes that happened in the land, such as the draining of wetlands and the clear cutting of different forests. So the kind of purple area that you're seeing on the bottom here is what was the Chicago Portage, or what was then known as Mud Lake. So you can see okay. There. So the entrance to the Chicago River is right here. If you didn't know, the lake shore used to be a little bit further west than it is right now. And the Chicago River would come down, and officially it sort of ended here, but this whole area was like a giant marsh before you got to the Des Plaines River, which is down here. So on a hot summer day, you would probably have to get out of your canoe and walk this mile and a half to get to the Des Plaines River. So you portage your canoe. But on a rainy spring day, this might entirely be a lake, and you might never have to get out of your canoe at all. Either way, this is by far the shortest route between the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River Basin. And so it is the quickest way for Native people to get to access these different trade networks and to visit people for purposes of trade, diplomacy, familiar relations, all of the above. Okay, so that brings us up to the kind of late 17th century and the early 18th century. And this is when we get the first contact between Native people and Europeans. This comes about a century before the American Revolution. And what I always like to tell people when we think about this first contact is that the Europeans that arrived in this region were entering a very established Native world. Native people had established protocols, they had these established kinship networks, they had established ways of talking to each other, doing diplomacy, trading, and all of that were things that European settlers had to learn and integrate themselves into. It wasn't as if European settlers showed up and suddenly were in charge, which I think is kind of a common myth. I love to show this map. This is also in the Newberry's collection, because I think it really highlights that that kind of feeling of an established Native world. This map was created using the written accounts of Jesuit explorers from the 1670s, but it wasn't published until 1718. But as you can see from the larger version, like there are Native people everywhere on that map. When we get into a little bit later period, we often are shown maps that are totally vacant of Native people. And it sort of allows these European empires to make claims to what they see as empty land. But I love this map because it shows us the exact opposite. It shows that the land is vibrant, that it's filled with Native people. They're interacting with each other, they're interacting with nature. And if we zoom in on the Chicago region, you can see the French have labeled this as Le Chicago, and you can see that they have marked that there are settlements there. So if this map is created based on accounts from the 1670s, that's the moment of European arrival in this region. It's easy enough for us to include that there were people living here well before the arrival of Europeans. Okay, so the first folks that come through this region, as many of you probably know, are Marquette and Joliet. Marquette is a Jesuit priest. Joliet is a French explorer. It was actually Kaskaskia people who are part of the Illinois Confederation who told Marquette and Joliet about the portage in 1673. And a year later, when Marquette came back through and he camped at Chicago, it was Illinois people who brought him corn, blueberries, and other sustenance that helped him get through the winter. So again, these people were very reliant on the Native guides that they met along the way and the Native people that they met on the way to direct them. The public monuments that you see today tell us a very different story. Many of you have probably seen these in person. These are two Chicago area monuments of that kind of showing that first contact. And as you can see in both cases, Marquette and in this case, Marquette, in that case, Marquette and Joliet are at the center and appear to be sort of leading Native people. This is not the case. This is not what happened in reality. In fact, it was Native people who were leading these two individuals and who ultimately helped them survive in those early years. Part of the other thing that we know about this region in particular, we know because of the fur trade and the records that we have of the fur trade. So this contract on the left is a fur trade contract from the 1690s that is a contract for the transportation of furs from Quebec through Chicago. This is actually the earliest mention of Chicago in the Newberry's collection, and you can see that somebody who owned it before us took a pencil and outlined Chicago. It's kind of midway through the page on the left side. But the reason that this contract is interesting is because it's actually signed by the native wife of the fur trader who the contract is with. So the contract is with a French fur trader named Francois Francoeur, but the contract is signed by his wife, Madeleine Saint Jean, who is an Onondaga woman. And so this, among lots of other evidence, tells us that Native women actually played a much larger role in helping some of these early settlers integrate into these kinship networks. As these settlers were coming into the region, the 17th and 18th century were filled with a lot of conflict across the Great Lakes. Basically the entire 17th century, there's a conflict going on that's called the Morning Wars that's causing lots of refugees from the east to come into the Great Lakes. From 1712 to 1733, we have a conflict called the Fox Wars. From 1756 to 1763, we have the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War that's happening. And again, not happening directly in this region, but some of that violence does get, or people get displaced because of that violence, and they end up coming further west into the Great Lakes. And then in 1763, we have Pontiac's War, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, but is essentially an effort to push back the British by Native people in the Eastern Great Lakes. Throughout all of these conflicts, Chicago is a place for people to gather before battle. Sometimes it's a place where they work out diplomatic agreements. And above all, it's a place that they travel through. But because there's so much instability going on, there's a lot of trepidation around new people that would be coming into this region. The British largely avoided this region because they were very suspicious of native villages southwest of the lake. And so British traders didn't even really try. And other newcomers who were coming into the region, sometimes French fur traders who were kind of left over from the earlier French era. And a little later, we get some Spanish traders. Those folks were viewed with an incredible amount of suspicion by Native people in this region because they were newcomers and people didn't know what their intentions were. The easiest way to not be a newcomer was to become a relative. And so many of these traders ended up marrying Indigenous women as a way to integrate themselves into these Native kinship networks. And I want to be clear, this was advantageous for Native nations too. It wasn't as if these Native women were sort of duped into these arranged marriages. They were often acting essentially as emissaries for their communities. And it was advantageous to them to have these connections with fur traders who had further connections out east and could bring in different kinds of supplies. So we see a lot of that during this time period. And we know that these Native women, were signing contracts on behalf of their husbands. So they were clearly more involved in the fur trade than we might realize. They also acted as translators for their husbands. In some cases, they helped with navigation. And they ultimately just helped with the integration into these kinship networks. Because she is often brought up, I will just briefly say the kind of most famous Native woman in Chicago that's known to have kind of played this role is the wife of Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable, whose name was Kitty Hawa. There's some debate over whether Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable was actually in Chicago in 1779, which this image is supposed to depict. It's an imaginary view of Chicago in 1779, or if he didn't arrive until later in the 1790s. But I mentioned him here before we actually move into the American Revolution, because Kitty Hawa is, again, perhaps the most famous example of this kind of relationship in which Du Sable, who was a European trader, came in to the Chicago region and integrated into Potawatomi kinship networks. Okay, so this brings us about to the time of the American Revolution, which is what you all are here for, right? As I hope I have made clear, by the time of the Revolution, this is very much still a land that is dominated by Native nations. This, is a map of showing different kind of colonial claims to the region during this period. These claims are imaginary. The different empires that are in this region, in many cases, are occupying a very small amount of this territory, and they are vastly outnumbered by Native people. In spite of that, they are claiming this land based on assertions that Native people as non-Christians could not own land. And so we get maps like these in which these imperial powers are sort of drawing out these imaginary claims, even if the reality on the ground is quite different. For our purposes, I want to just point out a couple of things. I'm going to do this again. So first, this line, right, separating the British colonies from these other claims of Great Britain. this line is the proclamation line of 1763. So it's the line that's drawn after the 7 Years' War. And one of the kind of biggest reasons that, well, not the biggest reason, but one of the reasons that colonists are getting increasingly frustrated with the British is that the British are preventing them from going over that proclamation line. This is actually called out in the Declaration of Independence because the British government has told colonists that if they go over that line, they will not defend them from native people that are likely to attack them for entering their land. And so in the Declaration, we have this line with the complaint that the British government will not defend colonists from, quote, merciless Indian savages. And that is actually about this. It is about the fact that colonists are not being allowed to go over the Appalachian Mountains and into this land. And so one of the reasons that they are very interested in separating from the British Crown is because they're interested in obtaining more native land and they're interested in moving further west. The other thing I want to point out about this map is that we have the kind of British claims here, and you have Spanish, what is being referred to as Louisiana here. This area, in which includes what is now Chicago, is kind of a no man's land. Like, it is entirely dominated by Native nations. It's technically part of British claims, but like there are no British people who are living in that area or even entering that area. If any, like most of the European settlement, if any, in the Illinois country is happening in southern Illinois, closer to St. Louis. So what is now Chicago is really beyond the purview of these European nations. And just to kind of emphasize this, it remains beyond the purview of European nations well into the early 1800s. As late as 1812, when the War of 1812 is going on, the Illinois governor, Ninian Edwards, actually has to have a map of what is now Northern Illinois drawn for him because he's never been there. And most of the only people that are in that region besides Native nations are traders. Like there's no American government in that area. So it's really, especially in this era, it's really beyond the purview of these European nations. Okay, so in spite of this kind of thirst for native land that's happening, Native people east of the lake are fighting really hard to protect their communities, and they really want to maintain independence as much as possible. Native people east of Lake Michigan are a little bit more willing to make alliances with the British, and in many cases that they do. But Native people who are southwest of the lake, in the region that we are now, are much less interested in making any kind of alliances with the British in particular, and they're very intent on staying entirely independent from these European powers. But to do so, they often sort of play these empires off of each other in order to achieve that. So I'm going to dive into an example now of this Potawatomi leader, Saginaw, who tells us, I think, can tell us a little bit more about sort of what is going on in this region. Chicago itself doesn't play a huge role in the revolution, but I think that this story does kind of give us a glimpse of what's going on in this era. So Saginaw was originally an Odawa leader from Michilimackinac. Michilimackinac is what is now Mackinac Island, right at the top of Michigan. However, he married a Potawatomi woman from St. Joseph. St. Joseph is on, yes, it is on this map. It is on the west side of Michigan, right there. So it's kind of the closest British fort to Chicago. So he marries a Potawatomi woman from St. Joseph. And in doing so, he's incorporated into the matrilineal kinship structure of Potawatomi people, and he becomes a Potawatomi leader as a result. Traditionally, Anishinaabe people relied on what were called Ojimog, or hereditary leaders who represented their communities. But the kind of chaos of the revolution changes this. And Saginaw is not recorded as having any of these hereditary claims, but he acted in this role by guiding his community through this very tumultuous period. And the fact that he had kinship connections in multiple places, from southwest of the lake where he was living all the way up to St. Joseph and to Michilimackinac where he was born, really helped him do that. So as I mentioned earlier, Native people living southwest of the lake are very intent on maintaining their independence, which is different from their relatives who are east of the lake. This majorly confuses and frustrates the British. They are used to a power structure in which there is one central leader, a king, right? And so they are very confused by the more localized government of the Anishinaabe, and they cannot understand why Anishinaabe people who are east of the lake are willing to ally with them, and people southwest, Anishinaabe people southwest of the lake are not. So this is something that they get really frustrated about. After the 7 Years' War and the proclamation of 1763, we know what's happening on the East Coast, right? Colonists are becoming increasingly frustrated with the British. They're eager to move across the Appalachian Mountains. Again, Anishinaabe people southwest of the lake are beyond the purview of settlers, and they're kind of starting to play these empires against each other. So that brings us up to the start of the American Revolution in the 1770s. War has begun. It hasn't reached this far inland, but leaders like Saganak are aware of what's going on, and they begin to kind of think strategically about how they can maintain their independence in spite of this imperial conflict. He and others in the region were most interested in working with imperial powers who would respect Native protocols, who would integrate themselves into Native kinship networks, and not attempt to invade Native land. A little bit surprisingly, based on what we know about the fact that Americans are very interested in Native land, Saganak decides that he has a better shot at this with the Spanish and the Americans than the British. He's just really not a fan of the British. And again, this is different from his relatives who are east of Lake Michigan. But I think the important context here is that in general, Native people who, especially Native people who were not allied with the British, really saw the British as demeaning. They saw the British treated them as if they were a conquered people, rather than really integrating into their existing kinship networks and respecting Native protocols. And so there's really a desire to maintain as much independence as possible. And Saganak as a leader is sort of interested in working with anybody who's not the British. At this time, he's mostly communicating with the empire that's geographically close to him, which is the Spanish, who have promised to respect their sovereignty. But he does interact with some Americans in a little bit later into the war. So it's in this context that he begins talking to Spanish leaders, and he's also sought out by American leaders in his attempt to remain independent from the British. For example, when George Rogers Clark led his attack on British posts in southern Illinois, Saganak sent a wampum belt. A wampum belt is a kind of belt of shells that Native people use to signal different kinds of alliances and record information. So he sends a wampum belt of peace, and he requests a meeting with the Americans, which ultimately happens later. He met with Clark in the fall of 1778, and he promised to share information about the American cause with his community. Now, notice he's not like, co-signing on the American Revolution. He's not saying, I've got your back, I'm going to be here for you. But he's sort of saying, yeah, I'll tell my community about what you're saying, and I've given you this wampum belt of peace, so I'm not going to actively attack you. So that's sort of where he's at in this moment. These early alliances with the Spanish and the Americans do reach British forces at Michilimackinac, and they lead the commander there, whose name is Major Arndt Schuyler de Peyster, to pen a letter, which now resides in the Newberry's collection, ordering British forces led by Charles Langlade to root out rebel sympathizers west of the lake. Among those accused of being rebel sympathizers were Saganak and Jean-Baptiste Pointe-de-Sable. Jean-Baptiste Pointe-de-Sable, as some of you might know, was actually later imprisoned as being a rebel sympathizer. He's released after the war, but he ultimately does get kind of rounded up in this attempt to round up rebel sympathizers. So de Peyster makes several attempts to first he tries to recruit, and then ultimately he tries to capture Saganak, all of which is unsuccessful. He also tries to get Saganak's relatives east of the lake to help him go after him, and none of them are interested in doing that. Again, de Peyster kind of majorly misunderstands the localized sense of Anishinaabe government and kinship networks. But he tries. In October of 1778, he writes this letter asking British leader Charles Langlade to go after these different rebel sympathizers. In July of 1779, he gives this speech at L'Arbre Clocher and tries to persuade Anishinaabe people in that area to help him get people on the west side of the lake to join the British cause. And then ultimately in 1779, once he sort of realized that he can't get Saginaw to be on his side, he unsuccessfully orders the capture of Saginaw using the ship Felicity, which doesn't happen. As a sort of fun aside, many years later, once De Peyster has retired to Scotland after the war, he writes a poem that's titled Speech to the Western Indians that is supposedly a versification of this speech that he delivered at La Fauché, which is in present-day northern Michigan. The poem's final verses read, Sly Siganok and Nakiowen, who was another Potawatomi leader, must with Langley their forces join, or he will send them tout au diable, as he did Baptiste Pointe de Sable. So he writes this kind of very interesting poem that names both Jean-Baptiste Pointe de Sable and Siganok by name. And yes, he does rhyme Diablo with Sable. So De Peyster is unsuccessful in recruiting or capturing Saginaw, and Saginaw's ignorance and evasion of British forces becomes more direct action in 1781. In that year, he proposes and he ultimately leads an attack of 60 Spanish militia on the British fort at St. Joseph, which is again kind of in the southwest corner of what is now Michigan. This might seem kind of strange, right? Why would Saginaw propose an attack on his own Anishinaabe relatives, let alone his wife's community? But the story here is much bigger, and it tells us that his actions are much less about any actual belief in the American causes or the Spanish causes, and much more about his interest in angering the British and distinguishing himself as a leader that could lead his community through these chaotic years. So Saginaw's forces ultimately capture the fort without firing a shot because prior to the attack, he sends in emissaries that request that the British allied Potawatomi stand down in exchange for half of the share of supplies that they ultimately capture when they capture the fort. He ultimately distributes those supplies, which kind of secures, him as a leader who will provide for his community. And again, rather than being about the American cause or the Spanish cause, he likely saw this attack as something that would directly benefit his community through the gaining of supplies. And it's likely that he thought that it might have actually been advantageous for him to be more allied with the Spanish and the Americans, and for his relatives to be more allied with the British. It sounds kind of weird to say, but if we have these kind of different alliances going on, that meant that Anishinaabe people could shift their alliances throughout this politically tumultuous period. And so they could sort of, if they had, people across these different empires, they could shift their alliances as needed. And so that's kind of part of what he's doing here. De Peyster is unsurprisingly furious, but also unsurprisingly, he can't convince any of his Anishinaabe allies to go after Saginaw. So he once again fails to capture him in any way. Interestingly, the Americans are also kind of alarmed by this attack. John Jay writes to Congress and says that they need to be really careful because the Spanish claiming of this fort could impact their goals of Western expansion after the war. This, doesn't come to fruition, but it's again interesting to know that the Americans are really thinking about Western expansion even while the war is going on. Okay, so taking a step back, what does this tell us about this region during the American Revolution? Overall, Anishinaabe people southwest of the lake are able to remain relatively distant from colonial powers that surrounded them, while still impacting some of these colonial conflicts. They would not really be more directly impacted by colonialism until several decades after this. Saginaw's actions are a good example of how Native leaders in this period often took advantage of the fact that there are multiple empires who are, vying for this land, and that he took advantage of the chaos of these imperial conflicts to advance their own interests. Finally, I think it also challenges a sort of familiar narrative of Native people during and after the Revolution. If we hear anything about Native people during the American Revolution, we mostly hear that they primarily sided with the British, and then we sort of get a declension narrative after the war in which Native people were sort of moved out and disappeared, which of course did not happen. But I think this challenges that familiar narrative by showing the ways that a Native nation actually, sided with the Spanish and the Americans in this case, and, did not move out of their land until several decades after this is happening. Okay, so what does happen after the American Revolution? Unsurprisingly, after the Revolutionary War is over, settlers pour over the Appalachian Mountains. They are hungry for that land and they are interested in settling in these places. That leads to a lot of conflict in the Ohio River Valley. There's a kind of series of conflicts that happens in the late 1780s and early 1790s called the Northwest Indian Wars. And there's just sort of constant conflict between the Native nations who are defending their homelands and settlers who are trying to come in and settle on this land. So in 1795, the Treaty of Greenville is signed. And this is a treaty that, cedes, as you can see, large chunks of land in what is now Ohio. But it also cedes a couple of strategic points that the American government sees as being strategic for their future interests in westward expansion. Those places include what is now Detroit, what is now Mackinac Island, and what is now Chicago. On the left here, we have a kind of zoomed in version. This is the first treaty session in Chicago, and it's a 6 square mile tract just around the Chicago River. So again, they have this eye toward expansion. This ultimately leads to the construction of Fort Dearborn. But interestingly enough, the Anishinaabe who are living southwest of the lake still remain very independent for several more years to come. After this treaty is signed, Siganak and some of the other members of his community actually travel to Fort Wayne and demand to know who signed away their land because they were not present at that treaty signing. And other Potawatomi people who were at the treaty signing did not have the right to sign that particular 6 square mile plot of land. So Siganak is actually ultimately compensated for that land, even though he was not one of the treaty signers. For the next several decades, there are several more treaties that are signed in this region. I'm not going to get into that today because it's not the purpose of our talk. But again, if you're interested, I would definitely encourage you to check out the Indigenous Chicago website. The kind of major change that happens comes in the 1830s, so several more decades down the road, and that is when forced removal happened. After the Treaty of Chicago in 1833, Anishinaabe people are forced to actually leave this region. There are 2 removals that happened directly from Fort Dearborn in 1835 and 1838, and then there are 3 more that kind of happen from the broader Chicagoland area, 2 in 1836 and 1 in 1837. I want to end by saying that in spite of these removals, Native people never relinquished their connections to what is now Chicago and this land. And Native people did not, of course, disappear or cease to exist. As many of you might know, we actually now have an Indian reservation in Illinois. That is because the Prairie Band of Potawatomi in 2024 spent about $10 million to buy back land that was illegally stolen from them in the 1850s. And it was in 2024, it was placed in trust by the federal government, and they are now a federally recognized tribe within this region. And so they come back, of course, to this reservation quite frequently and are very involved in the work of what is going on in Chicago. There is also a very large urban Native population here in Chicago as a result of a federal policy called relocation that happened in the 1950s. And so the kind of group that I often point most people to is called the Chicago American Indian Community Collaborative. Because it's a delegation of different Native organizations across the city that serve the Native community. They hold what's called the Native American Summit almost every year, in which they go down to the Illinois State Capitol and advocate for issues that are important to the Native community here in the Chicago region. And in 2024, they were successful in getting 2 major bills passed. One, HB 1633, now requires that Native history is taught in K-12 classrooms. And the other one, SB 1446, ensures that Native students can wear regalia at graduation ceremonies. So again, I encourage you to check out their work if you're at all interested in that. And I'm happy to take questions that people might have.